And it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of the next panel. George Salim is the Senior Vice President for National Affairs at the Anti-Defamation League. Before joining the ADL in 2017, he had senior positions in both the National Security Council and the Department of Homeland Security, serving under 3 U.S. presidents. Please join me in welcoming George Salim back to the podium. George?
Good morning, good morning, good morning. As folks do a coffee refresh, readjust, figure out if the breakfast goes in the compost, recycling, or trash bin. By the way, I'm a big fan of that setup. I need something like that at my house. Well, my kids would probably screw it up. Please allow me to welcome the panel as we get settled. We have a pretty incredible panel, and we've got a tough act to follow from the panel that preceded us to really set the stage for this. As we were planning, for the conference, one of the things that was really clear to all of the folks who took part in the strategy and organization was that the incidents of hate and bias and bigotry, Buffalo, which is on the agenda this morning, deserves more than a bullet point and deserves more than a one panel or one topic conversation. And so that's what this morning is really devoted to, is the patterns, the trends, the analysis, the response, and moving forward ultimately, as Laura and the team has really driven us to think through, is how do we prevent? And so what I'm going to ask our illustrious panel to do here is we're going to kind of start addressing a number of the issues as outlined in the program and the agenda. And what you'll allow me to do as the moderator is we've already kind of coordinated a number of thematic topics we'll go through. So with that, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Joanna Mendelson. We'll just kind of go down the line, and I'll ask my panelists to introduce themselves, give kind of a brief bio sketch on who they are, what they do, and this is what's really key to set the scene here. They're going to start to address their kind of thesis as it relates to the questions on this specific topic, on this specific panel, and then that's the question we're going to pull apart throughout the panel. So with that, Joanna, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, George. I'm Joanna Mendelson. I'm the Senior Vice President of the Jewish Federation based in Los Angeles. And I have a unique vantage point from my previous work. I worked at the ADL for close to over 20 years. And what I saw was the underbelly of our country. For years and years, I would monitor and look and work with a team of people who are looking at really the kind of the scars of our country. And what I'm excited about today is that we're talking about solutions, because there are hallmarks that we are all too familiar with, and we've heard it repeated throughout this conference. We've heard it repeated that disinformation and conspiracies have been the lifeblood, have been the mobilizing factor for so many of these individuals. We've heard time and time again that the weaponization of the online space is such a powerful tool, how extremists are mechanizing our virtual space in order to carry out violent action. They're using it to live stream, to seed their hatefulness on a global scale. They're learning how to augment their hate, to teach, to educate. And we're learning about the demonization of the other. And I think that is what is at the core. The demonization of the other, it's an us versus them mentality. It's essentially a victimization narrative that's at play. And the other takes different faces. The other, in the case of Buffalo, tragically targeted the African American community. But as we've seen, the face of the victim changes, and the ideology, however, remains the same. The small-minded, narrowed view of the replacement theory is such a mobilizing force that creates this fear of the other, that creates a space of us versus them. And these are the elements swirling together. And so we see that, on the previous panel, we heard about even in a single attack in Buffalo, we saw the anti-Semitic motivations targeting in the milieu of the perpetrator, and yet the target focused on the African American community. We saw in Poway, the perpetrator just 3 weeks before his horrific and heinous and life-changing attack on the Chabad synagogue, actually targeted a mosque and was motivated. So now we have this toxic soup. The toxic soup takes different flavors. But at the core, in some ways, hate is a unifier. These are ecumenical haters. There is nobody who is not caught in the crosshairs of the hate. And so for so long, as my work at the ADL really brought to light, that even in a single incident, hate is so overwhelming, and oftentimes that hate is enacted into real-world attacks. I worked on a case for months and months and months with the FBI. And this was an individual who was motivated by such hate, such self-hate. But his targets, his grand plan, was to not just attack the Jewish community, but was to attack a gay bar, was to attack women, all of this because of his various motivations, his own life experience. And so I'm acutely aware of the need for us to respond. What is the tool that is going to move the needle? Frankly, I'm fed up. We all should be fed up. I've had the privilege of meeting so many survivors here at this conference. And they alone should give us not only hope in their strength, but the desire to do something different. And so my work at the Jewish Federation really kind of gives us the opportunity to show up. Because although the Jewish community is seeing all-time highs, anti-Semitic incidents have never been at the levels that we're seeing today. But it is an opportunity for us to not only speak out against anti-Semitism, but to speak out against all forms of hate, because it is that great unifier. It is that great opportunity for all of us, because we are all in this boat together. And it's important to respond post-crisis, post-Buffalo, post-Pittsburgh. But what is the work that we're doing that's proactive? Because this is an insurance policy. This is how each of our communities can respond. How do we show up? And how do we speak out in a very, very loud voice? Because this is a long-term solution. And what I love about this panel is that there are many elements in the toolkit to respond to this hate, whether or not it's tech or education or law enforcement. But the community response is significant. And I just want to end with the notion that it feels overwhelming sometimes, right? The trends that we saw yesterday, the data points that we see, it is so disheartening. But how can we each have micro fixes? It's not solving the problem, maybe on a mega scale. We can try to do that. But more empowering is what each of us can do in our own communities, connecting with the other, breaking down those barriers, creating the connections. Because we are way stronger when we are able to do that.
Thank you, Joanna. Bjorn, if you could please introduce yourself, brief bio sketch, and then your thesis on this question of kind of the lessons learned from Buffalo.
Yeah, my name is Bjorn Eiler, and I'm the co-founder and director of the Cleef Eiler Institute and of Glacier Pill. And I'll come out of the closet pretty much immediately here and be like, I'm a survivor of the terrorist attack in Norway in 2011. And it's an honor and privilege to be among all of you who wants to work towards the same goal of eradicating this hate that you touched upon here. And part of my work has been rooted in my own experience, but also building a body of expertise on what this phenomenon is. Like, where does it come from? How does it look? And looking at that transnationally as well. And so we've been mapping essentially hate, trying to figure out what are the instances and incidents of hate and hate crimes, and how does that tie into kind of larger scale events that, in my view at least, constitutes terrorism. However, one issue that we see time and time again, both back home in Norway as well as here, is that domestic terrorism legislation is sadly lacking. And so one of the things that we've also been trying to document, and one of the things that is very documentable, I would say, with Buffalo, is the transnational connections behind these attacks. The shooter in Buffalo was inspired by Breivik. He was inspired by the shooter in New Zealand, by so many of the other shooters in between as well. And I think this constitutes a trend of what I've been calling the manifesto shooters for a few years now, where that in itself, to some extent, constitutes a transnational threat and a transnational terrorist movement. I know there are lawyers and prosecutors here, hopefully some prosecutors working on these cases. And my hope is really that we can elevate the discourse from being purely about communities and the affected groups, and elevate that to be, this is a transnational phenomenon, this is an international problem, this is something that we're seeing poison our world. And we need to address that and come together and show that this hate is something that affects us all, something that we all need to work together to counter, but also understand that the transnational threat is something that needs to be taken seriously on the racially and ethnically motivated terrorist side of things as well. For a while here, like between me starting working on this in 2011, 2012, and essentially Christchurch, our entire focus as a field in countering violent extremism, particularly in Europe, but also here, was largely on Islamist extremism and on the threat of ISIS. And that is fair to some extent. They also, constitute a significant threat, and we did in fact see in Oslo this summer Islamist-inspired terrorist attack on the Pride Parade, which led to the Pride Parade being cancelled and the deaths of a couple of people. And so, kind of coming back to the hate, what we've also seen is that the hate is largely the same regardless of the ideological excuse, if you like, that is tied to it. It is a self-hate by the perpetrator, people who cannot come to terms with themselves, and internal lack of faith in themselves to some extent that manifests in harm towards others. But there's also a unifying factor here in what the hate is. It is rooted in a perceived threat of, or a threat posed by diverse communities. And so that leads into our kind of definitional work of what actually is violent extremism, and understanding that from a perspective that isn't focused solely on one single community or one single group that is affected by it, or one single group of perpetrators, but rather encapsulates the entirety of the idea. And our work there has led us to the so far conclusion that violent extremism is the violent denial of diversity. Now, what does that mean? It means that communities that are often representative of diversity within a community are especially targeted by violent extremists. But it also means that our solution can be found in showing that there are ways of living in diverse communities, of being diverse, and accepting and celebrating that as a strength of our societies, that we can come together across faiths, across ways of life, across sexual orientations, gender identities, etc., that we can join forces, work together, and really create a better future. And so with the faith in humanity being part of the thesis here, I'll hand it over to you.
I appreciate that uplifting message. It's certainly something that is relevant with this audience. Maybe not people outside of this room, but certainly with this one. Thank you, Bjorn. Vidya.
Thanks, George. Hi, everyone. My name is Vidya Ramalingam. I'm founder and CEO of an organization called Moonshot, and we work on prevention of hate and violence online. And specifically, what we do is we work to reach out to people who are at risk of perpetrating violence online and connect them in with services, ideally at the local level, that can work with them to de-escalate them from violence, but also ideally to work with them to turn their lives around. And I suppose the overarching point that I'll make here is that perpetrators are human beings who, in more cases than not, leave us signals telling us that they're at risk. And as I learned more about the Buffalo shooter in the days and the weeks that followed the attack, it's clear that there were multiple glaring signals, moments where we could have intervened. Violence is fundamentally preventable. But in order to prevent violence, we need to build a local infrastructure, and that needs to correspond with a digital infrastructure, bearing in mind that our lives exist in 2022, both online and offline, to support that kind of violence prevention. And ironically, when people ask me about online prevention, I'm going to start actually with the local. And I can't stress enough the importance of state-level and local programming to better equip communities to identify, intervene, and also engage with perpetrators and potential perpetrators of this kind of violence locally. There is very little that we can do online unless that local infrastructure is there. And this needs to truly span every state in America. Resources so often tend to go to urban centers, and New York is a great example of this, right? You have New York City. It's very clear that resources need to go to New York City for violence prevention. But so often across this country, those resources overlook rural areas. Now, the perpetrator in the Buffalo attack was from Conklin, New York, upstate. Again, just a really clear example of where resources need to be distributed at the local level. But we also need to expand the remit of existing prevention services, whether focused on domestic violence, gang violence, or other forms of violence. More often than not, these kinds of organizations have the skills to engage with potential perpetrators of hate crimes or violent extremism. They just need the training and the resources to adapt their existing services and existing risk escalation procedures. But critically, and to come back to the online space, these efforts need to span both the online and the offline space. We can no longer think about violence as either taking place online or offline. The two are interconnected, they cannot be separated. So all prevention at the local level needs to have a digital component. And when we think about the online space, there's almost infinite opportunities for us to engage with audiences on the internet across this country. The main limitation for us as an organization is finding those right local service providers that are equipped and have the skills and the resources to engage with a potential perpetrator. We've now run several pilots, both across America and also up north in Canada. And over the last 2 years, we've seen really promising results from the delivery of intervention services over the internet with people that are consuming white supremacist content and hate content. In the last 2 years, in particular in the United States, we've been delivering crisis counseling services to audiences that are engaging hate content. And I want to just really briefly share some initial findings because it gives you a sense of the promise and the possibility here. Those engaging hate content in our pilot in the last 2 years in the US, those who were engaging hate content online were 3 times more likely than the general public to require de-escalation or an active rescue from violence during a crisis counseling session. Whether that violence was suicide, in some cases it was suicide de-escalation that was required, or violence against others. These are just initial findings based on a sample size of just under 200 individuals who were engaging hate content online that we offered crisis counseling to. But crucially, when you offer these sorts of services, these services have to be local to be effective. They have to exist in the community where the individual is based, such that you can reach a point where you're not just engaging online, but you can start to do offline engagement. And it's not too late after an attack like this happens to build these capacities locally. I really urge, if there's any state representatives or those of you working at the state level, if you have not yet experienced this kind of mass violence in your community, it's critical to start building up these infrastructures. But for those who have, it's not too late to do this. And this is what we're doing now in New York. We've launched a pilot program in partnership with the Citizens Crime Commission to develop their services to engage with potential perpetrators of hate and violent extremism in New York, and deliver the first online interventions program that attempts to engage with potential perpetrators across the state of New York. And we'll be doing a lot more to grow the capacity of organizations across the state who are engaging in this sort of violence prevention and get their services online to individuals who need it. But overall, if I can just leave a final point here, I fundamentally believe that change is possible if we can get these kinds of services to people who are considering violence and try and change their paths before they actually pick up a gun. You don't need to look further than the many former extremists who are in this room and working with many of organizations here to know that that kind of change is possible. But it does take sustained investment and building up a local infrastructure to make that kind of change happen.
Thank you, Vidya. One of the things that we've heard from all three panelists so far has been their kind of concluding points on the optimistic outlook that they have leaving here today, even in the face of a horrific event, an act of domestic terrorism. We've continued to hear about the need for a greater investment, and we've continued to hear about the lessons learned from these incidents and how it informs national as well as local programs moving forward. Let me turn to Nick. Nick, you've had an opportunity to see the aftermath and the readout of different events throughout your career in government and now post-government. If you can, share with us a little bit about your current role and kind of how you think about the lessons learned from Buffalo.
Sure, thanks, George. So I'm currently the executive director of an organization called the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. And as I mentioned yesterday, that means that's a small nonprofit organization that brings together in common cause and in joint effort 19 technology companies that are determined to do their share, their part, to deal with the online manifestations of terrorism and violent extremism. And as we've heard, that is a theme that has run through this entire 2 days here in Pittsburgh. So Buffalo, I'll start with the obvious, any attack that involves mass violence against a community is extraordinarily painful and costly to that community. But when you layer on top of that what we saw in Buffalo, an online dimension to that attack, the perpetrator not only bringing his violence to that community, but seeking to make that violence global and worldwide by live streaming it on the internet, that attack takes on even greater significance and requires even more of a coordinated response. My organization, the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, seeks to play its role in helping manage the aftermath of these horrific events through an incident response framework that we've tried to develop and mature and evolve in recent years. And again, this flows out of the horrific experience some years ago when the attacker in Christchurch, New Zealand, successfully live streamed for way too long a period of time his horrific attacks on the Muslim communities of Christchurch, New Zealand. So our goal with this incident response framework is to bring the 19 companies of GIFCT together in common cause. What can we do to respond more effectively in real time when an event like Buffalo or Christchurch is unfolding? When seconds matter, when minutes matter, when literally every minute something is up on the internet a while longer, it acquires more eyeballs and more potential to be circulated further and further. We've created across our organization a 24/7 information sharing framework that allows us to be sharing information among these tech companies in real time. And as you can imagine, tech companies vary in size and capability. You have a Facebook, which has a global presence of many thousands of staff persons working on issues like this, that is 24/7 and global in nature. And then we have other GIFCT members that are relatively small, newer platforms with very small teams who are stretched at capacity to cover things around the world. So sharing information between and among those tech companies is really important. What it does is it puts each of those companies on their front foot. When word of something happening horrifically in Buffalo is shared amongst our companies, they can all alert their teams and have them on their front foot, poised to take action against any content that might be circulated on their platform. And you will have heard from the previous panel, and you heard from NCTC Director Abizade this morning, that it was somehow viewed as a good news story that the live streaming was taken down after only 2 minutes. And of course, that's positive in that's a relatively brief period of time. but it's only kind of coordinated action among the tech companies that will allow us to limit that time even further. And that hopefully allows us to limit the spread of such material more successfully than we've been able to do in the past. So, what did we learn from Buffalo? Because after all, that's what we're here to discuss, is what did we actually learn from the horrific experience of the Buffalo attack? First of all, I would say, I would point to three things. First of all, I would say that the technology sector, or at least that segment of the technology sector that you would depict as mainstream, the platforms that most of us would have on our phones or on our laptops, the mainstream technology companies are making progress in limiting the ability of perpetrators to put this material in live stream form on their platforms and to have it stay up for very long. That is progress. But we also learned lesson two. Whatever we're doing, it's not good enough, because 2 minutes is too long. Any live streaming on a mainstream platform is not acceptable. And so those companies, our companies, continue to need to invest in ways to detect and ideally respond even more quickly to those rare instances when a perpetrator is live streaming their material. So again, no sense of complacency here, no sense of self-satisfaction. Doing better does not remove the need to continue to do better and to continue to invest in even greater capacity to prevent this type of material from spreading. And then my third and final lesson taken away from Buffalo, unfortunately, George, departs a little bit from the optimism or the optimistic tone that you said a minute ago. And that is, I think one of the other things we saw in Buffalo is that the extremist community around the world is adaptive and knows how to work around the defensive measures that we as the good guys try to create, try to work around the defensive measures. They modify content so that it can escape scrutiny or escape detection technologies. They find niche platforms that revel in the ability to put this kind of material up rather than have it as part of their terms of community service to prevent this material. Some companies actually love the chance to traffic in this sort of material. So while we are making progress among the group of technology companies that is like-minded and committed to doing better, we increasingly face an environment or an ecosystem where there is a dark part of the internet where we have yet to get the same kind of traction and reach. And so if there's a tough lesson out of the Buffalo experience, is that we've got a lot of work to do if we're going to change the incentive structure around those companies, the companies that, again, our previous panel colleagues pointed to, that seem to enjoy the ability to spread and traffic in extremism and hate. I'll stop there, George.
Great point. Thank you for that. By design on this panel, you've kind of heard from a range of perspectives, all of which do not represent, federal government, either in the U.S. or partners abroad views. On our panel last, my colleague Samantha Vinograd. Samantha, you've heard some of the views from the panel. You and I had the opportunity to be in touch minutes or hours after the event in Buffalo. In your purview at DHS, and as you all have started to think about, and the teams that you lead started to think about the response to Buffalo, what are some of the key lessons learned that you've observed in your current role at DHS? And feel free to kind of include some of your former roles in government and outside of government as well.
George, thank you. Both in my role at DHS and as a daughter of a Holocaust survivor, there's something that has been clear to me from such a young age that I bring to the work that I do at the Department of Homeland Security, and that is, hate does not metastasize overnight, and every single individual has both an opportunity, a responsibility, and the chance to stop hate that leads to violence. That's something that my father taught to me at a very young age and spoke about what could have been different in Europe if individuals had heard hateful rhetoric, stereotypes, and more, and had spoken up. That same lesson applies today in the context that we're speaking about. At the Department of Homeland Security, we know that hate-fueled violence is on the rise, and we know, and this is one of the lessons from Buffalo, Uvalde, Oak Creek, unfortunately the list is far too long, we know that there's an urgent need to build a culture of prevention against targeted violence and terrorism across this country. And from the Biden administration's perspective and the Department of Homeland Security's perspective, that has several core lines of effort, which I'll briefly summarize. As many of you know, President Biden published last year the first ever national strategy to counter domestic terrorism. DHS is deeply involved in implementing that strategy, in particular, implementing the pillar on prevention. And in the prevention context, DHS is really focused on three core things. The first is educating each and every member of the public, as well as all of the stakeholders represented in this room, across the country and globally, on the indicators that an individual may be going down a path to violence. What indicators are there that an individual may be radicalizing? Are there threats being made? Is there a lot of time being spent in an extremist chat room? Are there weapons being stockpiled, and more? What do those indicators look like? The second piece is, where do you go for help? And that's something that we've been talking about a lot in the meetings that I've been having, both in the summit, on the margins, and in other contexts. DHS provides a range of resources from across their 250,000 person plus department that can help prevent, detect, and mitigate acts of targeted violence and terrorism. That includes grant funding for promising practices. That includes work through our Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships to build prevention capabilities at the local level. I'll come back to that briefly in a moment. That includes information sharing through our Intelligence and Analysis Division, and that also includes physical security assessments through our Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Division. Those are just a few examples. But indicators and sharing information on what resources are available and where to access them. And under the President's national strategy, the federal government will be publishing online a prevention resource finder for federal prevention resources. The third piece, and this is one that we continue to work on and hopefully will continue to work with many of you on, is instilling in people the confidence to actually ask for help. Very often after an incident of mass violence, we hear that individuals associated with the suspect or subject understood that there was something happening, but did not feel confident, did not have the confidence to reach out and to try to get support for that individual. And we need to change that. We need to build confidence in asking for help at the earliest possible stage, and that is not something the department can do alone, nor the federal government. And that is why, at the department, through the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships and other means, we're doing something, Vidya, that you mentioned, which is we are engaging deeply, of course at the federal level, but at the state and local level. We are very focused right now on working with states on state-level prevention strategies that incorporate a range of promising practices from other prevention contexts like suicide prevention, domestic violence prevention, and more, ensuring that grant funding at the state level is going towards certain incredible pilot programs, ensuring that there are threat assessment capabilities, and implementing a prevention approach that is not law enforcement centric. Law enforcement has a critical role to play in targeted violence and terrorism, but if we want to stop violence at the earliest possible stage, we must ensure that a broad range of multidisciplinary stakeholders are trained in preventing targeted violence and terrorism and can get support when a matter doesn't quite yet rise to a criminal level. So if an individual is referred to law enforcement and it doesn't rise to a criminal threshold, that does not necessarily mean that care isn't necessary. And that means that all of us from all of our disciplines need to work together. At the federal level, the cooperation between HHS, the Department of Education, DHS, DOJ, and many others has never been stronger. But Nick, as you mentioned, we clearly must do more to meet the moment. And we are incredibly focused on working with everybody across the country from a range of disciplines to build that culture of prevention, to build state and local capacity through our resources, and then to instill confidence that, again, asking for help at the earliest possible stage is the best chance that we have to prevent acts of targeted violence and terrorism before they begin.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam, and thank you, panelists, for kind of laying down that great foundation. As you read the intro to the panel, there are kind of three core themes that we're going to spend the remaining portion on the stage together kind of discussing and flushing out a little bit. Theme number one is you've heard a number of the panelists mention this, the aspect of live streaming and how we've seen that play out in so many different instances. Second is the theme of virality, whether it's the live stream itself, either in a short amount of time, or some other content that we've seen in the previous panel started to get into this, whether it's the manifestos, the content, the ideology, the virality of the various forms of content. And third, as Samantha really started to illustrate, is the community response, or tools and resources for community response. And so I'm going to kind of break a little bit from our initial thinking going into this, and my first three panelists, Joanna, Bjorn, and Vidya, I wonder if you could spend a few minutes each talking about live stream content as well as the virality of some of the other content we've seen associated. And the specific question I wonder if you could just start to answer is, Joanna, Bjorn, Vidya, in your respective organizations, when there is some type of live stream content that's up, tell folks here, which they may have a different playbook, what do you do about it? Who do you pick up the phone and call? Who do you report it to? And what role do you see the virality of that content playing? And then after you three kind of start to lay out a couple key themes, Nick, I want to bring in the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, as well as the resources from the federal government to flag the type of content that may be harmful to communities and how they can potentially engage with DHS or other federal resources. So Joanna, over to you to kind of answer the question of if you come across, or your team comes across content that is, someone live streaming something against the Jewish community, or you have information shared with you, tell us a little bit about what that looks like.
Absolutely, George. So first to begin, I think after each of these attacks, there is an immediacy on elevating the perpetrator. And we see the lionization of the perpetrator, who becomes a hero. He or she becomes a saint. And that has a very, very motivating factor for others. And so I think in our response, it's how do we downplay that perpetrator? How do we downplay and not even put that name on our tongues as we talk about it, as we engage in our community? That just wanted to mention that. But in terms of the Federation's role, so we're connected to a larger umbrella called the Jewish Federations of North America. You'll hear from Julie Platt later on, who's our lay leader who chairs that on our national level. And we have hundreds and hundreds of Jewish organizations around the country. In LA, we have one of the largest infrastructures built out that every single Jewish institution gets notifications when there's an incident that's targeting their community. And sadly, the Jewish community has had to invest in efforts to protect our synagogues, our schools. This is something that has been, age old. Yet now we're seeing this morph into other communities. It's not just the Jewish community that Rosh Hashanah is coming next week, of the Jewish high holidays. It's not just the Jewish community that has to show their ID as you walk in to pray at a synagogue or go through metal detectors potentially. We're seeing other communities be targeted, churches, LGBTQ centers, anti-abortion, abortion clinics. And so the Federation helped to mobilize within California and around the whole country with JFNA to support what DHS offered with nonprofit security grants. Because having money, having the resources, $360 million went to supporting institutions around the country. Because this is a phenomenon, sadly, that we have to build our infrastructures up. But we also must work on the preventative side. How can we be mindful of multiple doors open in our synagogues or in our various communities? How can we mitigate some of the threats? How can we have hosts and ushers be welcoming but yet vigilant in how they're responding? How do we have a communication system that at the drop of a hat, if there is an incident? And so in LA, we have CSI, the Community Security Initiative, which can at a moment's notice notify every single Jewish institution in the entire region, and even have red phones on Shabbat when people can't pick up a phone because it violates the Sabbath rules, that the light alerts and then they know that there's a life in danger and mobilizes that community. So there is a way from our perspective that we're looking to mobilize, give resources, and reach way beyond the Jewish community because, again, all communities are part of this, this hate and extremism.
Thank you. Bjorn.
Yeah, you talked to the North American phenomenon here, but just want to highlight that the most securitized zone I've been in the last year or so was surrounding the synagogue in Vienna. There's been attacks on the synagogue in Oslo, there's been attacks on the synagogue in Copenhagen, etc. And so this is something that, again, transcends both the geographic regions and national borders. We're a tiny, underfunded, underground organization in many ways. And so we try to keep track pretty much 24/7 of what's happening in terms of attacks like these. And we do have a lot of subject matter expertise, both on groups and networks, in particular of what logic falls within the far-right extremist milieu, but also we have a contextual understanding that is international. And so in cases like Buffalo, for instance, Nick and his crew took care of the live stream too quickly for us to be able to respond in real time. But the manifesto,
Possibly a good problem.
which is great, and we've been working with Nick on making these things happening as well. And so, but the manifesto was spread around, right? And one of the things we did quick and dirty really quickly was put that through like college level plagiarization software and comparing it to other manifestos, because we scanned through it, read it, and saw like there's a lot here that we've seen before. And what we found was that it's basically copy-paste of Tarrant in New Zealand, right? And so Tarrant builds on Breivik, Breivik built on others, you know, seeing all of these ties between the manifestos, but all the surrounding narratives helps us create a clearer picture of what are the driving factors, but also what are the transnational connections behind these attacks. And so with that understanding, our hope in our work is to support organizations like GFCT, but also support prosecution, support national security organizations internationally in figuring out what the threat is, mitigating that threat, responding to it, but also preventing it. And so one of the things that Nick also kind of failed to mention about GFCT's great work is that they now have in place PDF hashing. And so the manifestos have been hashed, and that makes it easier to detect and take down when it's being shared. We also see that links are being hashed, and so that makes it harder to link to the platforms that are off-site really from the mainstream platforms. And so all in all, that helps limit access to these manifestos, which hopefully helps limit the inspiration they cause. But at the same time, we also see the same phenomenon where within extremist groups, there is hero worshipping, there is kind of sanctification of these people. And to undermine and to prevent that is kind of the next step.
That's the next level.
And figuring out how to kind of limit the gamification of these attacks, where we see things like kill counts being something that leads to a higher praise within the hero worshipping. And so the next step is figuring that out.
So, Video, would you agree that that's the next level? I mean, I know for a fact, and we've worked together on issues of hash sharing, content removal. You know, Bjorn kind of sets it up very, very nicely in terms of like what is the next level of programmatics to address these types of issues in your view?
Yeah, so I might kind of go back to your original question and then arrive at an answer to that question, George. So when an incident happens, so what we do at Moonshot, we have on-call teams who 24/7 are on call and awaiting a moment where they might get called on to duty because an incident has happened and content has gone viral. The moment they get that call, they begin an incident response. And our first priority there is understanding the scale and spread of the content itself, and whether that's video content or other content or a manifesto. We look at the spread and scale of that content itself. Priority number one within that tracking exercise is not just understanding the scale of that, the spread of that content, but also looking at additional threats to life that are emanating from individuals that are consuming that content, commenting on that comment, and having discussions about that content. So priority number one is how can we identify threats to life and immediately escalate that to law enforcement where required. Number two is, from our experience tracking these sorts of events over the last 7 years, we have historically seen after any terrorist attack, whether it was Pittsburgh, El Paso, Buffalo, after any attack in the United States, we not only see attempts to access whatever content was put out by the perpetrator, we always see an immediate escalation, a quite steep escalation in attempts to access white supremacy content, anti-Semitic content, anti-Black content, basically content against any minority group that these groups typically target, regardless of who the target of the initial attack was. So priority number two for us is how do we not just lose focus on the wider environment here, the wider hate environment, if we're just focused on this one piece of content, because there is this moment of heightened risk across the board when any event happens. Priority number three, and this is something that's newer for us as an organization, but it was a conversation that emerged in the aftermath of Christchurch, and this is where I actually want to push us to go beyond hash sharing and beyond content takedowns, and recognize that regardless of whether it was 24 hours before a video got taken down or 2 minutes before a video got taken down, once that happens, you now have a substantial audience that has watched a horrific piece of content, a piece of content that is likely to have left them with some form of trauma, whether they recognize it or not. And in the aftermath of Christchurch, we were talking about millions across the globe who had witnessed this video, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And in a case where a video gets taken down within 2 minutes, it might not be millions, but you're still dealing with a portion of the public that have now experienced some form of trauma. So the question that we're now asking ourselves is, beyond the questions around content takedown, how do we deal with the impact that this content has had in the moments that it was available online? And how can we start to reach out to audiences, and not just extremist audiences, because we are actually talking about the general public here. I mean, the general public are so often coming into contact with these kinds of videos when these attacks happen. So the question for us is, how can we actually use some of our online tools that we've developed to engage with perpetrators and actually reach anyone in the general public who has now experienced trauma and is going to need some form of care? And so that's an emerging question that I would love for us to address.
Perfect.
Can I pick up a little bit on what Vidya said, because it actually
please.
flowed from the panel discussion I was a part of yesterday in the afternoon. And there were only a dozen of us or so in the conversation, but I think it's worth bringing some of the points that we discussed there to this wider group, because most people who encounter this material on the internet, as Vidya said, will not be fellow extremists or like-minded future perpetrators. They'll be people like you and me who are just watching what's going on the internet, getting some kind of alert from one or another of our social media accounts. And yet we have a responsibility not to make the bad situation worse with the way we deal with that content either, whether that's retweeting a manifesto, as Bjorn kind of indicated. Why you think you're just sharing information about the horrific thing that's happening in this part of the world that you care about? Well, you're actually now increasing the reach of the individual, the perpetrator, who is trying to gain global reach with your own actions. So again, just the simple acts of being mindful and careful as you encounter this material yourself, in terms of what you're doing to amplify this material, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps not with malevolent intent, but contributing to this global ecosystem that we're all talking about in an unhelpful way. And then to Vidya's further point, self-care matters here too. If you stumble onto this material, if you yourself become exposed to this material, self-care becomes an important part of the equation as well. There are some links you can never unsee if you have been exposed to them. And I think each of the technology companies understands that it has a responsibility to take this material down as quickly as possible, but that isn't always possible in real time. As we talked about in a crisis response mode, it can be minutes, hours, or even days before material is taken away completely. And so we will have to find ways to deal with the aftermath of exposure to that material, not just from the perpetrator side, but from the broader societal side as well.
Perfect. Samantha, the Department of Homeland Security and other entities of the U.S. government have been an amazing convener of the various parties, whether it's community, whether it's NGO or whether it's social media platforms to discuss these issues, and also kind of provide resources, education, information sharing platforms, et cetera. In terms of what you've observed, can you tell us a little bit about the best practices you've seen as it relates to the convening, the community empowerment, as specifically on the topics of the virality and some of the social media content that we've seen contribute not just to Buffalo but other incidents?
Sure, certainly. So DHS has ongoing communications with a range of partners to include members of the private sector, and regularly shares analysis, expertise, and thoughts with all of those partners. As it pertains to the social media companies, we continue to encourage social media companies to uphold their terms of service, and there are specific channels that are in place to share credible threat information with the federal government as it pertains to a range of matters, whether it's election security or potential criminal action. In addition to that, I'll highlight, separate and apart from those critical and urgent information sharing needs, as well as a larger ongoing discussion about social media companies upholding their terms of service. We've touched on some really important points just in this back and forth, one of which is the social media hygiene that every individual using social media should be aware of, to include not retweeting, not liking, not commenting on phrases, because that then accelerates the virality of this content. The other is the need, after this content is absorbed, for there to be a support network. I talked about that briefly in my opening remarks, but Vidya, you mentioned this. After an individual absorbs this content, reacts to it, what kind of care is there within a community to explain what has happened and to provide support? And so from the federal government's perspective, from DHS's perspective, we are very focused on working with DOJ, HHS, state and local counterparts to build that resiliency within a community such that everybody is understanding what they may have absorbed, what not to do with it, and how to react to that. And we'll continue to do that work because I don't know whether I fall in the optimistic or pessimistic category. I'm going to put myself in the realist category, just as we continue to try to approach this evolving problem. But this is not going away. And by virtue of that, we need to educate not just ourselves. Everyone in this room has an association with this problem set in one way or another, or is a subject matter expert, but our children, our parents, and everybody else in our community. And we will continue looking at ways to increase resources to do so, to build that community resiliency, both before this content hits social media, before these attacks occur, and at the back end as well.
Thank you, Sam. As we start to wrap up this panel, we are getting ready to hear from members of the community from Buffalo and hear about their experiences. And so as we start to transition some of the lessons learned, as we start to think about some of the best practices we've taken, not just from Buffalo, but some of the other incidents, let me just do a lightning round down the panel. Joanna, if I can, I'll start with you. And what we were asked to come and speak to on this panel are a range of different topics, but in the last moment here each, specifically on preventing hate, both at home and across the globe. That's kind of the framing question. Give us kind of 1 minute on the key theme that you want to impart in the audience on preventing hate, both at home and across the globe.
So I really think that the antidote to hate is how we respond and the long-term approach that we are taking. It's as Sam mentioned, it's in the investment in the next generation. It's how we give our kids the tools to respond, not just tolerate differences, because that's a very low bar, but truly, truly embrace the other. And I think for us, it's how we shine a light on the goodness, because we are far bigger, far greater than the perpetrator. The ripple effects of that perpetrator and their impact is monumental. And I can speak from Los Angeles, 2,500 miles away from Buffalo. We felt the impact of a community grieving, a community targeted. We felt the loss and the sense of security. And so working with the mayor's office, the Jewish community, along with all of these other religious groups, lit a candle. We lit 10 candles and we honored that victim. We talked about their story. We lifted up and we elevated each of these human beings because their lives were snuffed way too soon. And how do we react in the face of hate? How do we respond? How do we show up? That is the true testament of our character, of our humanity. And I do sit in the camp of optimism because we are shining a light on these bad perpetrators. But we, again, as a community, are far greater, far more powerful, and we're far stronger than the act of one individual.
Thank you, Joanna. Bjorn, one key theme.
We focus too much on the perpetrators. In this room, that's fine. It's important that we understand who the perpetrators are and where they come from. However, our strength is not in those who go down the path of hate and executes acts of violence. Our strength is in all of those who do not, in understanding that there are so many people who are doing amazing things, first of all, already, in various ways, both inside of this space and outside of it, to prevent the spread of the kind of hate that manifests in these acts of violence. But also to understand that we need to build on the infrastructure of that and build communal resilience, not just at local levels, but again at global levels against this type of hatred. And I think by focusing more on all of those who do not go down these paths, but also by focusing more on the survivor communities, the communities that are affected deeply by these attacks, making sure that there is the infrastructure to provide the care for those who are not only affected by the online content, but directly affected by the attacks as well, is really key.
So important. Thank you for mentioning that. Vidya, key theme, preventing hate both at home and across the globe.
I think these days it can feel very overwhelming. Just even turning on the news these days, it can feel like there's very little we can do to stem this wave of violence that we're seeing across the country. And I suppose if there's one point I would leave you with, it's that it's not too late. It's not too late for us to build up the local resilience and the local capacity across this country to actually stop this kind of violence. And I think we have to hold on to hope. And I actually will take it out of the pessimistic, optimistic binary and actually just talk about hope for a second, which I think,
I like it.
I think is slightly different. Like, we have to have hope that we can do something. If we lose that hope, then we're what is there for us? How is this country going to proceed? So I am genuinely hopeful. The people in this room and the people behind this event and the communities that are present today and the communities that have really shown up in the face of trauma and violence, like that for me shows me the hope that this country can have. And I've seen people who have done the most awful, horrific things turn their lives around. Some of them are in this room. We know that people can change, and I truly believe that if we can build up a strong prevention architecture across this country rooted in local communities and truly engaging at the, even online in this nebulous world of the internet, I believe that we'll be able to stop individuals from picking up guns and carrying out violence like this. So yeah, just thank you everyone for being here, and please hang on to that hope.
Thank you for that frame.
And I'll build a little bit on that hope from Vidya as well. I think the good news story here, and it is good news, is that prevention does work, can work, but it needs investment. It needs to be informed by local conditions, by local communities' insights. So yes, hold your federal government accountable, hold your law enforcement authorities accountable, hold tech companies accountable for the environment that we're in. But solutions can and will be found at very local levels, and it would be obviously far better for communities to arrive at those solution paths before a tragedy rather than in the aftermath of a tragedy.
I will also put myself in the hopeful category, in that the strength of the partnerships that the federal government has and will continue to build is expanding exponentially, and that will help us prevent acts of targeted violence and terrorism. The one takeaway that I would share is every individual has a role to play in preventing targeted violence and terrorism. And from DHS's perspective, we are committed to equipping and empowering every individual to do just that, whether you are a law enforcement professional, a social service professional, a doctor, a teacher, a school resource officer, faith leader, or a member of the public. We have resources available. We have and will continue to expand them and to ensure that everybody knows how to access them. And we're in this together. We're in this together.
Thank you, Samantha. And I want to pick up on the last theme that Samantha mentioned is really a role for every person. And so as we prepare to transition this panel into the next conversation, what we know is that every person does have a role, and you're going to hear a firsthand perspective of how communities were impacted from Buffalo. So we kind of started this morning with a strategic look in terms of how this happened. We transitioned to some of the key lessons learned and focusing on the content, the virality, the live streaming, what communities can do, best practices, lessons learned. Now it's time to transition to hearing actually from communities in Buffalo, what they heard, what they saw, and really what they've been dealing with afterwards. You know, yesterday, Rabbi Jeffries made a point in a meeting where he said, I'm not proud to be a member of this club, the club of survivors of an act of domestic terror. And so, unfortunately, this club has grown. You know, his words really resonated with me yesterday. It is not a club that really anybody wants to be in. And so as we get ready to transition here, I want to ask you for two things. I want to ask you to first, round of applause to thank this panel for a great panel. And next, I want to transition to my colleague Laura Ellsworth to introduce our next conversation. Laura, over to you.
All right. As you know, the summit is intent on bringing the voices of those affected by violence to the table, because those are some of the most important voices that we need to hear from, because it informs the work that all of us do, as you just heard on the last two panels. So for this panel, we are privileged to have a number of members of the Buffalo community, two here with us and two remote. And if we can bring up our remotes in real time, that would be terrific, so we can welcome them here. Reverend Blue and Zenaida, welcome to the summit. We're honored to have you here. We thought we would start off this morning with Garnell Whitfield, who has been for decades a very prominent member of the Buffalo community, well known to many people there. And we've been really privileged to have him here at the summit. Many of you have had the opportunity to meet him and to talk with him. But Garnell, can you just sort of give us all a little bit of background about you and your reaction to being here at the summit?
Sure. As she said, my name is Garnell Whitfield. I am the eldest son of Mrs. Ruth Whitfield, who was the eldest victim at the Tops Massacre. My mom was 86 years old. I'm here with my brother, Raymond. We're very excited. I don't want to use the wrong word, but we're very happy to be here amongst like-minded persons. We've been wonderfully blessed to have the opportunity to meet other victims and to meet people who are working on these issues. And we're very thankful for that. We had the Tree of Life, persons from the Tree of Life came yesterday and wrapped their arms around us. And the Collins family is here, and so many others that we've had the opportunity to meet. It's pretty powerful when you understand that you're not alone, because that's how we felt for some time. So thank you for having us here. I'm a former commissioner of fire for the city of Buffalo. Worked in Homeland Security for the governor for a couple of years. So I have a background in dealing with these issues, but this is very different now because it's very personal, dealing with my mom.
Understood.
Yeah.
When we originally reached out to you and invited you to come, and we said we thought you might find some things here that you didn't know. Are there some things that you found here that surprised you about the summit and that you'd like to share with the audience?
Sure. We've been to summits. We've been, to the White House. We've been to a lot of places, but I've not been to a collection of this many people from the varied backgrounds, the kind of expertise, whether it's wellness, runs a gamut, the DHS, Homeland Security. So to have all of these people and all of these resources in one place is very unique in my estimation. Also, the focus, as was mentioned by several of the presenters, about the focus on disseminating information to the local level, down to the states and the local level. As a local person, I find that to be very, very encouraging.
Great. Zenaida, you were unable to be with us here today because you were with, we know, Zaire last night and doing something very important in Buffalo. So welcome to the summit, and we welcome you to share your thoughts with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting us. Sorry I couldn't be with you all, but my name is Zenaida Everhart. In my professional life, I serve as Director of Diversity and Inclusion for New York State Senator Tim Kennedy. And my personal life, I'm just Zaire's mom. My son, Zaire Goodman, was shot and seriously injured on 5/14. He suffered a gunshot wound through his neck, which exited his back. He is healing. He's doing really, really, really well. And the doctors are hopeful, and I'm hopeful. And Zaire is just a remarkable kid. I say kid, I call him the kid, but he is a 21-year-old man. He will always be my kid, but he's remarkable. He is healing through this. He's still under doctor's care and going to therapy. But all of his doctors are hopeful of his recovery, although this will be a part of his life, the rest of his life. He's taking it in stride, and he's doing well. He's doing well, and thank you for having me.
Okay, we're honored to have you here. One of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about is what we all, as people who work in this field, need to know about people who have experienced this kind of loss and trauma and their families. For all of us who want to help and to do something, what would you tell all of us to be aware of and to know from your perspective?
There's a lot to do. There's a lot of work that we need to do. I know in the preview how much more we have to do. And for me, my focus is, obviously as a mother, right? Number one, my focus is making sure that, Zaire gets some sort of new normal out of all of this. And he goes on and lives a fruitful life. But my focus is bigger than that. It's Buffalo community, the east side of Buffalo specifically, because as you know, Buffalo is a very segregated city, which is the reason why this terrorist was able to find the Black people, right? He knew where we lived. And for me, it's about education. In reading his manifesto, we clearly could read that, he was misguided. And his misguidance is systematic. In America, we don't teach true African American history. We don't tell the story of what America did to my ancestors. And that terrorist had no idea the community that he was attacking. He didn't know who he was attacking because he didn't know who we were. He doesn't know who Black people are in this country. And the other part of that is, speaking of systems, and racism is deeply rooted in this country. It was founded. This country was founded on racism and hate. And our laws, in many ways, reflect that. And so we have to start there as well. Not only do we need to fix our education system, we need to fix the laws in this country because they don't help everyone, they help the few. And that's part of my job in my professional life, right? It is my job to figure out which laws that my boss, Senator Tim Kennedy, can support and sponsor and co-sponsor that are going to help communities like the east side of Buffalo. And that's how we fix these things. But another part of that is something I talk about often, and that is the idea of privilege. And when our white allies hear of privilege, it's kind of a trigger. And I get it, I understand it. In my professional life, I do this. I host racial healing circles to talk about privilege, but talk about it in a way that isn't so triggering. And for me, when we talk about privilege, it's about sharing privilege. My boss shares his privilege with me. He is a white man. And he shares that privilege with me because he understands that he can put me into spaces where people wouldn't normally listen to me. And me being with him, he knows they'll listen to me and they understand and they can hear me. And so that's a huge message point that I like to get to people, to our white friends and our white allies, is that sharing your privilege doesn't always necessarily mean opening your pocketbook. Sometimes sharing your privilege means recommending someone for a promotion, right? It's sending an email and helping someone get a job or get into a training program, or simply shopping in a community that you would never shop and telling your friends about it. That's shared privilege. And I think that that's one of the things that will help communities like the east side of Buffalo, because the issues of the east side of Buffalo are not unique to Buffalo. There are east sides of Buffalo all across this country. And so if more of our allies and our friends go into neighborhoods like the east side of Buffalo and, just go to a store and shop there and tell your friends about it. Go to a restaurant and tell your friends about it. That is how we build up community. That is how we help our Black friends and our Black communities across the country.
Thanks for sharing that. Zenaida and I are both moms, and we sort of connected as moms, didn't we, on this? And on the issue of shared privilege, it's so perfect for this conference, because what we are all doing here is sharing our personal relationships with one another, who we're contacting. Many of you here met people from, right, the secretary, the director, the DHS people, each other, people you didn't expect to meet. The summit is all about sharing our privilege. We all have privilege in different ways, and we are all sharing that with one another. And so I just thought your comment when we talked was just so beautiful and so true and so important for all of us to listen to. And
can I make one more point on that shared privilege?
Please.
Because I tell people that what I just said, but I have privilege.
Yes.
Right? I have extreme privilege.
Yes.
And I have privilege in that my parents were advocates for education, which, pushed me into college, right? But also the privilege that that is shared with me, I share it with my community. And so that's what it's about. That's all it's about.
No, that's great. We also have with us here Terry Connors, who is a community leader in many, many different respects, and who I just want to thank personally for helping us make outreach to Buffalo. Obviously, as we know from the guidance that we've been given by the families here in Pittsburgh, who are our friends and our neighbors, it's a very difficult thing for people to come and speak about these issues, much less in a situation like this. Mm-hmm. And Terry was just incredibly instrumental in helping introduce us to these really wonderful people. So Terry, thank you for that. And share some of what's going on in Buffalo writ large and what different people in this room might be able to do to help facilitate what's going on.
Well, you've just met two members of remarkable families in the city of Buffalo. And I'm privileged to help them through this horrible nightmare. But there are others as well. We speak for other families who lost loved ones, who were injured, who were terrorized by this zone of danger created by the terrorist. And my job is to shine a light on the darkness of hate. What these families have asked me to do is incredibly impressive, and I feel it as though it's one of the biggest burdens of my professional career. Not once have they ever asked me as their lawyer, what will my compensation be? Or what will I recover? All they have asked, because their pain is deep, but their anger is even deeper. All they have asked of me is to find out the answers to the questions that plague them right now. Why is it that an 18-year-old has access to an AR-15? Why does he have access to body armor that no civilian should have access to? What happened when our red flag law was activated and he circumvented that process itself? What about those digital platforms that foment the type of hate that resulted in May 14th, the massacre at Tops? And we put together a formidable legal team. My associate Ben Crump, his associates from DeCell 11, in conjunction with the Brady Center, are going to shine a light on the darkness of hate. We're going to get there through litigation. And some of you may have heard about the litigation progress that occurred at Charlottesville, the one that's pending right now by the DC Attorney General on January 6th. Litigation is a powerful tool, and it's my privilege to represent these families, to pursue those answers to questions that they are entitled to have answers to.
We have a track on legal solutions, and one of the things that the legal system does, as Terry talks about, is it finds answers to questions in an organized and orderly form. And it's up to the parties to those cases to decide what to do with it, but the process of rule of law is a powerful and we think underutilized tool on the civil side to help understand what the facts are, organize them, and thereby point solutions. So thank you, Terry, for what you're doing. Reverend Blue, you are, again, a very important leader in the Buffalo community and have been for a long time. Can you share with us your background and the role that you're currently playing post this attack to help the community of Buffalo get back on its feet?
Yes, and thank you for allowing me to come to you through Zoom. It's been a lot of hurdles, but we're here. I am Reverend Mark Blue. I pastor a church in the city of Lackawanna, which is a stone's throw away from Buffalo. I am born and raised in Buffalo all my life. I am also the president of the NAACP of Buffalo, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Currently, I am a co-chair for the 514 Survivors Fund, which was initiated by TOPS to hire a company, the National Compassion Fund, which helps victims and survivors in mass tragedies such as this. And our task is to try to help our survivors and those victims to have some semblance of healing. We know that no amount of money can ever repay or erase the tragedy that has happened in our community and to the ones who have been affected. But also, we need to look at how we came to this. We were totally unaware, unsurprised. Nothing like this has ever happened in the city of Buffalo. Although, yes, we are one of the racist cities, and when you look at it, and it's not from my standpoint, nationally, surveys have been taken, and you will find Buffalo on the top of the list. But there are a lot of mitigating circumstances that has brought us to this point. We were a soft target. There's a lot of things that we should have been doing, but because of complacency, nothing like this has ever happened in Buffalo. We we didn't do our due diligence, some of the things that we should have done. So with food insecurities in our area, yes, we're an easy target. With a lot of businesses not having their base in the east side of Buffalo, yes, that makes us an easy target. A lot of awareness has been brought to us because of this tragedy. And with that, now there's time to make some changes. Even when you look at the beginning of the NAACP, it wasn't an organization of privilege, it was an organization of equity, bringing all walks of life together to make a systematic change in society that will erase or to cancel racism, white supremacy. One of the things that I believe in is that uh, white supremacy, people aren't born racist. It's learned behavior. And what's learned can be unlearned. So we have an awesome task to unlearn this practice and these policies that have been initiated through the government as well. Because why should I fear when I don't look like someone else? I should be treated the same as everyone else. I shouldn't have to worry about white privilege, black privilege, green privilege, Hispanic privilege. I should be taken face value as an American living in a society that's supposed to treat me the same way as it treats everybody else. I believe we all have the right to be free. We all have freedom. We all have a right to be to transform our lives into the best possible life we can ever have. But because of these barriers, because of these practices, we now come into a situation like we are now, where terror has stricken our community. But I have to say this, when that happened here in Buffalo, you did not see one act of violence, no looting, no cars being overturned, no fights being broken out. What you found in our city was a city not only of good neighbors, but a city who believes in one another. Yes, we have made some great strides, but we still have a long way to go. We had prayer circles. We had every nationality of individual in the city of Buffalo come together to try to bring some healing in our city. We made strides, but we still have a long way to go. So I am excited to be where I am and to be a help to our community. I take it as a privilege of honor to make sure that there's equitable distribution and equality for all of the citizens of Buffalo.
Thank you, Reverend Blue. We talked earlier yesterday and a little bit earlier today about the power of sports and what we can do in the world of sports to take on some of these issues. And we've been privileged to have the Buffalo Bills, the Sabres, the Pagula Sports Group, a very material part of that. So Zenaida, can I ask you to just take a hot minute to describe what you and Zaire did last night and what you think that said, what that meant to you and what you think that said to the world?
Yeah, so yesterday was the Buffalo Bills' first home game of the season, and they invited members of all of the 13 families that were directly impacted to the Bills game yesterday, and they did a beautiful ceremony. Before the game started, they invited us down onto the field, and we heard a short documentary that was done just surrounding the 514 massacre. But also we heard from Buffalo's poet laureate, who constructed a beautiful poem around, just the healing that happened after 514, or the healing that continues to happen after 514. And it speaks volumes to exactly who Buffalo is. Having the Buffalo Bills do that. But from the start, though, they've been, on the ground on the east side of Buffalo with us. And we're definitely grateful to them, for just stepping up, but for not forgetting, right? And sharing their privilege, right? We go back to that. They shared their space with us. And that speaks volumes to exactly what Buffalo is. We are known as the city of good neighbors, and and not just the Buffalo Bills. So many community groups have reached out to all of the families affected, and just they've just been wonderful. They really, really have. I told someone the other day, I came home and my kindergarten teacher, crazy enough, stopped by to bring me 13 quilts that her knitting group put together for each of the 13 families. And I have to get those out to everyone. But it's just that level of, yes, we need legislation, we need change in education, but it's those little things like a comforting blanket. And so, yeah, the Buffalo community has been amazing. And Zaire enjoyed the game yesterday, and it was a lot for him because that's not his jam. But he was able to be there with the families, and they were able to see him, and they love seeing him. So it was a beautiful day yesterday. It really, really was.
That's great. What you all have described is something very similar to what we experienced here in Pittsburgh, which is in our darkest moments and in a time of just overwhelming evil, the overwhelming goodness of the rest of the community won. And what we have attempted to do and what the summit is attempting to do is to perpetuate that goodness one to the other, where all of our eyes were opened here in Pittsburgh to one another as citizens, regardless of race, regardless of age, regardless of religion. It opened our eyes to each other. And I'm hearing that that happened in Buffalo too. And one of the reasons that we invited our friends from Buffalo to the summit, and one of the reasons the summit exists, is to find out how we, all of us as individuals, can be a part of continuing that action. And so with just a couple of minutes, Garnell, I'm going to ask you, as somebody who has been here for a few days and had the courage to come here, and I just want to sincerely thank you for that. I know this was hard. You've experienced the people who are in this room, the families who are in this room, the experts who are in this room. Can you share for us what you're going to take back to Buffalo and what your ask is for Buffalo from all of us in this room?
Well, thank you. Again, I want to thank you for having us here. It's been a wonderful experience being exposed to the other victims and the expertise and having an understanding of the work, that there is work going on. So, we don't feel like we're hopeless. We are encouraged by what we've heard. The announcement from the White House, from the persons representing the White House about the different initiatives that they're undertaking specific to Buffalo, having come out of Buffalo. So we're very excited about that. We look forward to establishing a rapport and a relationship going forward with all of you, and I think that's very important. So we're not just going to leave here and go back home and maintain the status quo. We're very excited about some of the initiatives you guys are doing. We're going to try to take them back to Buffalo and replicate them and work. As was said earlier, this didn't start on May 14th. Buffalo has a lot of long-standing issues that have to be addressed. There's a reason why we're a segregated city. There's a reason why there's redlining and all the other things that have facilitated that down to the years in Buffalo. And this gives us an opportunity to address those things, to have these discussions and to talk about it and to call it what it is. Hate, racism, bigotry, white supremacy, we have to talk about those things in the light of day. We have to acknowledge them before we can address them. And so those things all have to happen, and we look forward to having those discussions and working on those issues going back to Buffalo.
Well, can I share just one thing? Because as much as we've gained from this summit, I just want you to know that I've never had a prouder moment than when I sat behind Garnell and Zanetta before the Senate Judiciary Committee and the House Select Committee, and they testified and told their truth. But the reason I make that point to this group is you have an amazing ability to advocate for change.
Right.
their appearance before these two committees and with our governor in the state of New York has resulted in changes in legislation that we never imagined would have happened 10 years ago or 20 years ago. This group has a powerful presence, and to advocate for changes that can actually be accomplished, that we can see are real, is something that can come out of this summit.
Terrific. I cannot think of any better words to round up this panel, so my profound
But
thanks.
can I
Oh,
just
sure, Reverend
add-
Blue,
add
sure,
one more thing?
sure.
Change takes place around the dinner table. We have to have those real communications and talks with our children. Not only do we need to talk it, but we need to don't talk the talk without walking the walk. That's a saying that we've often used. We have to demonstrate that to our children. We have to expose them to different cultures, to let them know that their particular culture is not the greatest or the best, because it takes all of us in order to make a change. Exposure, education, we have to continue to talk these things to our children because it's learned behavior. We're dealing with learned behavior, and we need to be proactive instead of reactive. This conference has taken place because it is reacting to something that caused that stimulus in our society. We have to be forward thinkers. We have to make sure that we have these conversations, and we have to be proactive. I'm tired of being on the menu. I want to be at the table. I want to be at the table so we can help make some changes in our society instead of having them talk about what's good for me when they don't know me.
Okay.
We have to make these changes around the dinner table, and I just wanted to share that.
No, thank
Can
you,
I
Reverend.
follow up with something?
Sure.
And so following 514, speaking of Pastor Blue's point, Zaire and I started Zanette and Zaire's book club. We put together a wish list on Amazon. And since then, people have bought books off of that wish list. They have bought over 15,000 books. And each of those books teach kids about diversity and different cultures and, just different people. And it's been an overwhelming experience, but it's been amazing. And that's exactly what we want to do. We want to teach children. We want parents to read to their children about different cultures and about different people, because that's where it starts. As the pastor just said, it starts with if we're teaching them about different cultures and different religions and different colored people, then that's how we create change. Absolutely. And like Terry just said, in my statement to Congress, one of the quotes that I made in that statement was, our differences should make us curious, not angry.
Beautifully said, all of you. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. Please join me in thanking this extraordinary panel.